Hey, MindsEye is a mediocre game that feels like a little microcosm of the games industry crash, and I want to talk about it. MindsEye is a third-person action game set in the near-future city of Red Rock City. You play as Jacob Diaz, a pretty hot war veteran with a high-tech chip implant who is trying to unravel his mysterious past. It sort of bills itself as a game like Mafia or Grand Theft Auto with an emphasis on cutscenes and story elements built around an open-world design. It's made by a studio called Build a Rocket Boy, founded by big-name industry executives formerly from studios like Rockstar Games and Ubisoft. Originally, it was envisioned as content to be included in their in-development free-to-play game platform Everywhere, but gradually over time it kind of became its own standalone product. I feel like I really can't talk about what MindsEye represents industry-wise without talking about what it is, so let's start with that before I talk about Build a Rocket Boy. Oh, by the way, this video will have spoilers, so you might want to back out now if you're planning on playing the game yourself. As I mentioned, MindsEye is set in near-future Red Rock City, kind of a parallel version of Las Vegas. Marco Silva, a fake version of Elon Musk who is also a rich immature nepo baby, operates his business Silva Corp out of Red Rock. Silva Corp does all the things that real Elon Musk does. He makes rockets, robots, cars, and stuff like that, but the difference is that he actually does them with some level of credibility and success. Meanwhile, in the city, the local party-agnostic mayor is corrupt as hell and is sort of a backstabbing menace who is intending to use everything in her pocket to attain a mayoral re-election. Enter Jacob, our war hero veteran Latino protagonist who is a bit of a hunk. In a tour of duty, he was possessed by an otherworldly power, causing his drone to shoot his squad and leaving him with bouts of PTSD-like symptoms relating to this experience. Now he's arrived at Red Rock and working at Silva Corp as a security guy with the ulterior motive of finding out more about his random memory loss and how it relates to the chip in his head. Over the course of the game, you perform various missions, mostly helping fake Tesla with violent corporate espionage by murdering a lot of people. Jacob meets a hacker named Charlie, who he also recruits to work for Silva, and they form sort of a will-they-won't-they bond. Eventually, the gang at Silva starts noticing that the robots have started acting a bit funny, but they kind of just decide to ignore it for a while. You do this for a bit, and then partway through the game, the mayor and Marco Silva are attacked by the military, and the mayor is killed. You learn that Jacob's power is alien in nature and that the general knows about it, and he's planning on stealing it for himself. Enter the final act, where the military declares martial law in Red Rock. I don't think that's how the military works, but whatever, and everything starts getting gritty. Jacob learns the robots that are going rogue are doing so because they're possessed by the aliens, and they're being used to help the aliens invade. Jacob's missions now start becoming focused on getting his friends to safety and beating all the bad guys one cinematic at a time. You shoot a shitload of more robots and dudes, and at the climax of the game, Jacob eventually throws himself into a dimension portal in order to save the world, resulting in the most whiplash-inducing video game ending ever.
What I have to do! Nobody else is dying for me.
Oh, wait, sorry, just kidding. There's a post-credit sequence which implies that that actually didn't do anything at all, so great. Anyway, that's kind of the whole plot. If it sounds pretty thin, that's largely because it is. Characters' motivations are either I like technology or I want this guy dead. The game introduces like a whole cast of them who might help Jacob in one or two missions, but they don't really add that much in and of themselves. They're all pretty well acted and likable, but they don't just individually have that much going on, you know? And what's more is that like nothing else in the wider world even really exists. I mean, presumably there's some sort of like government or people beyond the bounds of the city, but if there is, it's pretty much never mentioned or talked about. Like, I assume there are other people in the world not wound up in this web of conspiracy, but I've only ever ran them over with my car for fun, and you don't ever actually talk to any of them, so it's all kind of moot. There are some other factions that are described as like mercenaries and militias that are living outside the surveillance state, but they kind of just exist as like cannon fodder for you to shoot and run over throughout the game, and they don't really add that much substance to the world itself. Thematically, the game, at least early on, leans heavily on the tension between near-future ideals of technical progress, things like flying cars, future warfare, surveillance infrastructure, things like that. You fight robots equipped with rifles, witness autonomous workforces, and see various sites of a world that's slowly developing reliance on tech. And it's like an interesting tension, but then it's sort of sidestepped when aliens come into play and the narrative just starts to feel more like a schlocky sci-fi B-movie. And I think I'm kind of just surprised by it because MindsEye really doesn't choose to have anything to say about any of this. Not that games always need to have something to say, but I think it's kind of expected from a narrative-heavy game like this, and setting itself in the near future next to sites like Elon Musk and Tesla feels like a setup for that. Kind of like how GTA is often set in the modern day and in places like Los Angeles, and it's very intent on satirizing and calling to attention the myth of the American dream. But largely this never really feels like the case with MindsEye. Jacob is more or less a player conduit that just witnesses interesting scenarios or cool ideas, but the narrative never really tries to pull any of that to the surface. It really doesn't feel any more complicated or thought-provoking than something like a budget asylum film, which is weird considering how much it tries to reach for relevancy. Like, for most of the game, you play as a hired hitman for fake Tesla, and by and large, it has nothing to say about our relationship to Tesla or technology or big corporations, nothing at all. Like, I'm sorry, you can't introduce a character directly based on a billionaire who has been actively engaging in undermining and attacking democratic institutions and not have anything to say about that position. At times it even tries to make Marco Silva like a sympathetic character who ultimately has good intentions, which also feels more tone-deaf to me than anything. And it's a shame because I think it does have the bones in there for a narrative that could be very thought-provoking. Like, I think the premise of a war veteran trying to earn a living in a world that commodifies conflict and violence is like really good material for building an interesting character moment or an interesting sort of script. Or even like a conflict between having trauma related directly to technology and having that technology pervade every aspect of your life. There's plenty of interesting angles to explore. And this idea of coming like really close to something good is a common theme throughout this game. I'll talk about it a little bit with the gameplay. The gameplay in MindsEye is not terrible, but it takes a long time to actually get fully to that point. Most of the early game almost exclusively consists of driving between point A and point B. You start at point A, character tells you to drive to point B. You spend 5 minutes driving to point B while exposition happens via another phone call. When you reach point B, you shoot some stuff. Then you drive back from point B to point A while another call happens, and at the end you get a cutscene. Near the end of the gameplay becomes a bit more robust, with a lot more subversion and interesting combat set pieces, but by the time that comes, you're about 10 hours in, and the game basically ends shortly thereafter. Occasionally you run into side content, which the game boasts are made in their custom scenario editor, which by and large consists of shooting sequences or kind of trivial bits of gameplay. There's this one where I placed some robots in a tower defense sequence and just sorta watched and hoped they didn't die. I think it took about 30 seconds before it was over. In another instance, the side mission had Jacob monologuing about how terrible war is.
People are gonna die, but you never know who. Could be your friends. Could be you.
I shot soldiers in an unknown village to go rescue a hostage, and when I did, the game proudly told me I achieved a bronze rank, as though I just won a prize at a fun fair and not like relived a PTSD moment. The guns and shooting themselves, I think, is actually pretty competent. What I find it does with it is maybe at a level of a 2011 cover shooter, but on the whole, it's honestly not bad. Some of the level design I found to be a little rough though. A lot of levels are made to be bi-directional, so you'll have to backtrack and have shootouts in both directions at varying points. Designing a level to work two ways sounds very efficient on paper because you get double the usage out of one space, but it's actually a lot harder to design for, as any change you make will affect players and enemies in both directions, especially where cover is involved. It made a lot of levels feel awkward, like tight corridors with weird angles where it's very hard to navigate, like the level design was kind of fighting against you the whole time. Sort of gives the energy that like someone said it'd be cheaper to reuse levels, and they ran with that despite making everything feel a bit worse because of it. I think it's a lot of little stuff like that which just makes it feel like a death from a thousand cuts. Here's some examples of little things I noticed as I played. Despite having a free roam mode, there's no way to view the world map aside from the minimap at the top corner of the screen. You can't look for side mission locations or plot a path to a certain landmark or area. It's kind of an open world game without a world map. In one mission, I drove to an objective marker which forced me to exit my vehicle in front of an active turret with no cover around, leaving me to die. I got around it by running away from the combat zone and just re-entering it from a different direction. In another instance, the game kept failing me for trying to drive into a tunnel that I always drove into when ending missions. Like, I had done this like 8 times. Turns out it was the one time that they wanted me to park outside the tunnel because my vehicle was too big to get in, and because there was no in-world objective marker, I just missed that completely. Oh, of note, the flashlight is perhaps one of the worst I've ever seen in a video game. It's projected from the drone following you instead of on the camera, as games would usually do. So if something is in the way of your drone, like a cover or a wall, the light is blocked completely. If the drone gets stuck, it also teleports back to your shoulder, and the effect is so jarring it actually kind of made me nauseous. And the AI, perhaps to make them seem smart, are very eager to flank you. Unfortunately, there's many spaces that are just tunnels, so they tend to push forward super aggressively, and it makes the shoot them when they walk around the corner tactic super effective. Another problem is that the enemy spawns are largely trigger based, which means that the game expects you to be like pacing your advance in a very specific way. So if you fail to understand its implicit pacing in some of the set pieces, then it's very easy to just get surrounded and die through no fault of your own. And while there's a fair amount of gameplay variety in itself, there's a lot of very niche and specific gameplay elements that you'll see and experience maybe once or twice and then never again. For example, early on in the game I played a rhythm minigame where I did CPR on some random dude. After a couple failed attempts, I finally understood what it wanted me to do, only to have that minigame disappear for 8 hours and come back once again near the end of the game where you have to dig a grave. Another minigame had me adjust the position of a satellite, which, again, I did exactly once and I never saw it again. Granted, sometimes I think it's fair to focus on one moment if it's like a key story beat that you want to have a lot of significance, but sometimes it felt like the game just lost interest in itself for a while or needed to prove that it could do other stuff, and then it just sort of got off track. A lot of the narrative climaxes are also solved via cutscene, which almost always feels anticlimactic and really feels like they just had to cut corners wherever they could. One moment has you fighting Bert, a man out for revenge against Jacob. He smack talks you a bit in a cutscene, and then as soon as gameplay starts, he immediately runs out of frame, and the fight consists of you shooting waves of drones before he then falls off the building in the next cutscene. I think the only proper boss fight in the whole game is when he comes back later, but instead of a boss fight where you like shoot him or something, you're stuck in drone mode and you have to zap him 3 times and then you just sort of win. Ta-da! There's also another cutscene where you go from driving a vehicle to shooting robots that are running behind you, which I'm convinced was an action sequence that they cut from the final game because getting the robot AI to do that is probably very expensive. But to be clear, like, despite these grievances, I really don't think this game was by any means unsalvageable. None of this is terrible. Like, you'll run into a mission that feels like it was a bit rushed or made under the gun, but I do think that the shooting and movement feels pretty good, the drone control is interesting, and the driving is often pretty satisfying to do. In fact, I go so far to say that the driving is some of the best feeling I've experienced in an open world game. I guess it makes sense considering you only ever drive like maybe a dozen cars, if that, throughout the course of the game, which makes it easier to tune than a true open world game where the team would have to tune every car in the game. But if the driving was bad, considering how much you do of it, the game would fall apart, so it's good that they're really focused on it. Nothing MindsEye really does improves or exceeds things you've seen in any other game since like 2011. The cover shooting you've seen, the drone control you've seen, the driving you've seen, the hacking you've seen. What it does competently, but none of it is super new or innovative, so I understand why people would have a muted response. But what I'm trying to say is that all the small parts of this game are done well enough and done so competently. I think it's plain to me that the developers behind these smaller moments of gameplay generally knew what they were doing and how to execute it well, but it feels like something else happened. Now, I'll say a lot of this is just going to be conjecture. I don't work for Build a Rocket Boy, I don't have a full view on what happened there. But from what I've seen from MindsEye, I do believe that the development isn't a reflective of MindsEye, but rather of a different game, one known as Everywhere. Everywhere was supposed to be a Roblox-like platform where players can create custom game content and play online with friends. In 2022, MindsEye was first announced, and in 2023 it was supposed to apparently be exclusive content Everywhere, where it would be an episodic game set in various universes within the platform. Then gradually over time, MindsEye became its own standalone game, and big components of what Everywhere was supposed to be can be seen half-baked in MindsEye. And I hadn't actually heard of MindsEye or Everywhere until literally the day of this game's release. I heard word on Twitch that there's a game so bad they're canceling sponsorships midstream. Let me tell you, this game is so jank they don't want you to play it is the most surefire way to get me to play games because I'm a freak. Anyway, after the game came out, co-CEO of Rocket Boy Mark Garrard implied in the game's Discord that there's a concerted effort to trash the game in the studio. The publisher then dismissed that idea, and this really just feels like a wild conspiracy he made up to sort of save face. But what isn't a random conspiracy is that MindsEye didn't do well. A wave of 100 people were laid off from Build a Rocket Boy post-launch, followed by another 300 receiving redundancy notices, implying they too might be laid off. I mentioned before, but I really think on the surface there's little offensive about MindsEye. There's not a lot to the game that stands out as being one thing that should have caused it to implode on itself like this. And in cases like that, I'm always usually inclined to think it's not what the game did that killed it, but rather what happened surrounding it. MindsEye is just in a constant state of juggling things that it can't execute on. It wants to be an open world game for open world players. It wants to be a story game for narrative enjoyers. It wants to be a GTA Online for multiplayer gamers. It wants to be a massive content platform like Fortnite. It is exceedingly ambitious in scope and scale, and it wants to be everything for everybody, and in turn it's nothing for no one. And to me it feels like that's because at some point someone decided that MindsEye needed to be everywhere. In a lot of cases like this, the people at the studio, the people working boots on the ground, almost assuredly knew what an unbelievable dream shipping a platform like Everywhere was, especially alongside development of a whole other game like MindsEye within it. Build a Rocket Boy was a multi-million-dollar development studio formed by industry veterans and executives, but they had never shipped a game as a studio before. And not only that, but what they were talking about shipping was a multiplayer online platform to challenge Fortnite. And MindsEye was supposed to just be a stepping stone, just one small piece of their puzzle. The fact that MindsEye slowly slipped its way from being a sort of proprietary tech demo and into the role of the main product they needed to sell tells me that leadership likely knew Everywhere couldn't come to fruition. Sometimes when studios get desperate, they just need to get something out for shareholders, publishers, or whatever potential grants they might have been sitting on. It doesn't matter if it's good, it doesn't matter if it's finished, it just needs to get done. Instead of MindsEye being a small part of what people could build in Everywhere, Everywhere had become a small and disappointing part of MindsEye. And it's a shame because imagine if they ditched the idea of making a GTA Online style multiplayer layer and just doubled down on making a coherent and cinematic narrative story. Or where they stop making this cinematic heavy narrative and just focus on the GTA Online Everywhere style game. Imagine if they ditched the game entirely and just consolidated all efforts on making Everywhere better, instead of building MindsEye as a tech demo within it. There's core elements to MindsEye that work well, and unfortunately it all gives the feeling of a ship full of very competent sailors who were steered wildly off course by an overly ambitious captain. Captains who, by their own admission, seem to be unable to hold themselves accountable. It wasn't the leadership's fault that launch was going bad, it must have been a different studio trying to ruin us. Leadership couldn't have made mistakes, it must have been some elaborate ploy to attack us. It's not that we made a series of snowballing mistakes over the years that ultimately made our studio crumble. It must have been some unseen, unknowable force. I don't know, I just can't shake the feeling that MindsEye just feels like a perfect microcosm for how the games industry just is nowadays. There's frankly a lot of cases where we see patterns just like this one. New studio opens up with bold and unproven ideas. Leadership talks a big game as they gather funding. Development ensues, they become mismanaged into oblivion, trying to match up impossible metrics of success set by themselves and the industry. Eventually, if they're lucky, they barely manage to cross the finish line in one piece. Before you know it, all the people who made that game were laid off, despite having shipped an entire game and it still continues to be sold. The people who made it are left with nothing to support them or their families, and leadership simply blames the boogeyman and runs off to a job elsewhere. In the post-pandemic game development crash, this is the way that video games are made. And MindsEye feels like just another victim. A game held to impossible standards by those at the top, made by people who tried their best given the circumstances, which amounted to a bunch of miserable press and a whole lot of hurt for the people on the bottom. The reality is that most of the time there is no unseen force that ruins things like this. It's usually done by someone real and tangible. And increasingly in the games industry, that's the people at the top who are hoarding the most profit at the expense of everyone at the bottom.